Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulina wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. This is Jamal Diwan with Safa Center for Research and Education, again covering the book Guide of the Believer of Imam Mustafa Umar. And this is a very simple text, as we mentioned before, on purification and prayer. It's largely according to the Hanafi school, with some mentioning of other schools as well in various places. So we started in the introduction, and now in this section we're going to finish the introduction. And where we left off is where he begins to talk about the 5 types of rulings in Islamic law. So one of the things that's necessary as kind of an introduction before we get into discussing the rulings themselves is to know what kind of rulings are there. So essentially there's 5 different categories here. This is the obligatory, recommended, permissible, disliked, and prohibited. So the first category is that which is obligatory, meaning Allah and His Messenger have made this obligatory on us. It's not something that is optional. And if we omit it without an excuse, we are sinful. And if we do it, we are rewarded. So an example of this would be praying 5 times a day. The second category is recommended, that which is sunnah or nafil. If one performs this act, it's counted as a good deed. But if we omit it without excuse, we don't incur sin. So an example of this would be praying the sunrise prayer, the duha prayer, that's in the time after sunrise and before dhuhr. And this is something that's meritorious, it's beneficial, we can be rewarded for doing it. But if we do not do it, we're not sinful. So it's not obligatory, it's just recommended. The third category is permissible, meaning that it is kind of in between the two. Doesn't necessarily count as a good thing, doesn't necessarily count as a bad thing. So this is just a normal behavior. Number 4 is that which is disliked or makruh, and avoiding this can be counted as a good deed, but if we do it, it doesn't incur sin. So for example, washing the left arm before the right. When we're making wudu, the right arm should come first, but if we do the left arm first, that's something that would be disliked, it would be makruh. We're not sinful for doing it, but again, it's something that should be avoided. And the 5th category is that which is prohibited, haram. And in this category, if we do it, we are sinful. Without some sort of major excuse, we're sinful. And if we do not do it with the intention of not doing it because it is haram or prohibited, then this can be a means of attaining reward as well. So these are the 5 categories. Every action that has a ruling in Islamic law will be categorized into one of these 5. So we can look at them and figure out how does any particular action, look at it and figure out where does it fall. One of the things that also comes up, as he mentions in the introduction here, is that there are many differences of opinion in Islamic law. We talked about previously the different madhabs and the approaches to the study of Islamic law, and there's many examples of these differences that exist in the schools and even amongst the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ from very early on. Part of this is because the Quran and the Sunnah are texts. You know, when we look at the Quran, when we look at the Sunnah, we're trying to understand text, and oftentimes these interpretations of those texts are going to be different. One of the ways to come to rulings that are not specifically mentioned in those texts is to use something which is called analogy. So juristic analogy, maybe someone, for example, modern drugs are not mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, but by extension of the ruling that is applied to alcohol, which covers the intellect, then we can say that these modern drugs have the same consequence as that alcohol, and therefore they have the same ruling as the alcohol, which is that they are prohibited. But the main issue here is that there's 2 things to consider when we're dealing with text. One of them is the ambiguity of the text, and the other one is the authenticity of the text. So with the Quran, there's not going to be any debate about its authenticity. Everything in the Quran is authentic. But when it comes to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, these hadith have varying levels of reliability. And so scholars will debate their level of reliability, and then that will have consequences in how the rulings are derived. And then the second side of it is the ambiguity or the clarity of the text. How clear is it on the particular ruling, or is it not? One place this comes up, for example, in the Quran is with how do we make wudu? And it's mentioned in the verse that وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, wipe on your heads. And what does the question here is the ba that comes before your heads. What does it mean? Does it mean a little bit? Does it mean the whole thing? Does it mean some of it? So these are different possibilities based on the Arabic language and how the hadith is understood in light of that Quran, that verse of the Quran. And so you'll find difference of opinion on this question. There's legitimacy and wisdom behind these differences. The wisdom, one of them is that the text having some level of ambiguity and some space for interpretation forces us to deal with our minds on the text. There has to be a process of interpretation, so it keeps the engagement with the text very fresh and continuous. Also, the book itself, then the Quran, for example, the book itself isn't so detailed and literal all the time, but it is artistic. It has spiritual wisdoms as well as it has practical rulings. And we see this issue of difference of opinion again through the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. One of the examples was that there was a case one time when they were outside of the city, and there was a man who had a wound on his head, and he was in a situation where he needed to make ghusl. He was in a state of janaba, he needed to make ghusl, and he asked the people he was with, what should I do? And they told him, you have to wash this. And the consequence of that actually was that when he washed it, and it was a big wound, it became infected, and he suffered as a result of it, and he actually died. And when they came back to the Prophet ﷺ, he told them, they should have asked, they're the reason for his death, they should have asked when they had this difficulty. But the thing is that there was a process of trying to understand what to do here. More clear examples, one of them is when some of the companions were traveling through the desert and they had no water and they needed to make the ghusl, and so they had no water, so they made tayammum, and they found water later on and there was time left in the prayer. So say for example it's dhuhr time, person doesn't find any water, they make this tayammum, which we'll cover later, and they pray dhuhr. Then before the time of asr comes, they find water. Do they have to repeat the prayer or do they not repeat the prayer? So one of them repeated the prayer, one of them did not repeat the prayer. And the Prophet ﷺ responded to the one who didn't repeat his prayer by saying, you have followed my teachings and your prayer counts. And he turned to the other one and said, you get double the reward. So the point here was that there was a difference of opinion amongst these companions as to how they should respond to that scenario. And the Prophet ﷺ essentially affirmed that both of them were correct options. A third case is that there was a military expedition and the Prophet ﷺ told them, do not pray Asr until you reach this place of Bani Qurayza. And along the way, the time of Asr was about to end. So a group of them, they said what he meant by that was that hurry up and get there. So we're still going to pray now, even before we get there, because we have to pray on time. And the second group said, no, he said, do not pray until you get there. And so even if the time for that prayer ends, we're not going to pray until we get there. So there were two different options that were taken by this group, and they didn't blame each other. They still continued on the journey together. And the Prophet ﷺ did not criticize either one of them. When they came to him and they told him what had happened, he said basically that they were both right, and these are both options that can be dealt with. So what do we do when we see differences in opinion? The first thing, because a lot of times you're going to learn something, and you may see someone doing something else which is contrary to what you learned, which does not necessarily mean that it's wrong. It could be another opinion that is actually correct, or it could be an opinion that is wrong. So what do you do? First thing, if you see a Muslim doing something that is different from what you know of, then you should investigate. Not blame, but investigate. If you really feel like you need to ask them, what is your basis for this? Why do you do this? So on and so forth. The second thing is that if it is determined that the person is doing it out of ignorance, then you can correct them. The third, if they're doing it because they learned it from a legitimate source outside of yours, then you shouldn't correct them, and you should be content that they have learned something and you've learned something, and now you know a little bit more. If it is something that has to do with larger issues related to the community and its well-being, then in this case there should be scholars or people of knowledge who are referenced in its regard, because perhaps, this is an opinion that's valid historically, this is an opinion that's valid historically, but in a particular context it may not be acceptable. And so if it's affecting more than just an individual's personal piety, if it's affecting the entire community of believers, or more lives than just one, then this is a good time to kind of bring someone else in and get their advice as well. But the point is that there are legitimate differences of opinion, and we shouldn't be adamant about one over the other. And when we learn and we study, then we begin to have a deeper understanding and appreciation of this. So with that, we finish the introduction. Inshallah, in the coming videos, we'll cover the topics of purification and prayer. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.